Okay, well, first of all, thank you to Acero for the opportunity to present this morning, and just want to say, and congratulations on another great event. I always appreciate coming to Acero summits because of the quality of the discussion, the engagement with the speakers and the participants in real issues, real problems. So many events these days are just television ads for whichever people are there to present about their companies. So for the last day and a half, you've seen a lot of numbers, a lot of charts. I'm going to give you some more numbers and some more charts, some of which will seem similar and some of which I think are complementary to what you've seen. And really my goal is to try and connect the dots, right? We've talked about direct exports from China, we talked about indirect exports, and we've started to talk a little bit about manufacturing. And so I'm going to try and see how these all fit together for Latin America. And so I'm going to start with some general slides on China's overall export posture, bring it down to what we see happening in Chinese exports within Latin America, and then move to call it a case study of what China's indirect exports into the Mexican automotive sector is telling us. Okay, just to start with some general slide, high level. This chart shows the development of China's direct exports and indirect exports since 2005 here. And what you see, the red line are the indirect exports, and they exceed and have every year exceeded direct exports since 2017. 2017, of course, is the aftermath of the huge surge in direct exports that we saw and that you see in 2014-15, which led to the question of Chinese excess capacity and Chinese subsidized exports, making it to the top of the agenda of the G7 meeting in Tokyo that year, such that pressure on China, and I think the previous speaker alluded to this, sort of led to a sharp fall in the direct exports and the beginning of a strong increase in indirect exports. I'll point out that I think there's pretty solid information through 2023. The information for the last 2 years or going through this year is, I wouldn't call it speculative, but sort of estimations. They're much more estimations than just even the prior years. Okay, so first of all, where are China's indirect exports going from a sector standpoint? And draw your attention, first of all, to the top of the bar charts. You see that automotive exports of, you got to be very careful with the phrasing here. Chinese indirect steel exports going to the automotive sector have grown from whatever it is, 9% to 19%. You'll see at the bottom that the all other, which is generally lower value steel containing items, has decreased from 59% to 37%. Again, I think this trend has been mentioned before. China is moving up the value chain, if you will, in its indirect steel exports. Now, a couple comments. I think, again, I don't have the data here yet for 2025, but it's pretty clear that the automotive sector share of Chinese indirect steel exports has probably increased well beyond the 20% that we see here, 19%, probably approaching 25%. Now, the other thing that's worth noting is mechanical machinery, and that's in the orange, and that's also been growing. Again, that's another type of value-added export which China has been moving into. Now, this can be machinery exports can be a double-edged sword, right? Because on one hand, to the extent that it displaces existing equipment manufacture, it is obviously undermining or weakening steel consumption and manufacturing. On the other hand, it can be, and this is not, by no means certain, it can be a positive insofar as those machinery exports represent productive assets, right? Productive capital assets, which actually allow or encourage the development and growth of domestic manufacturing. So this is one where the devil's in the details, right? And we're going to try and get to some of those details. Country-wise or region-wise, again, draw your attention to the top of the chart. Latin America. Latin America has gone from 4% as the recipient, if we use that word, of 4% of Chinese indirect steel exports to 9%. Again, this is only to 2023. Again, we would expect that percentage has actually increased and is actually the fastest growing region, right? I'll say except for Russia in the last 2 or 3 years, but again, that's a unique situation in that Chinese indirect exports, particularly vehicles, to Russia really took off as Russia pivoted to a wartime economy and basically all manufacturing kind of became oriented to support their invasion of Ukraine. That, again, significant. Chinese indirect steel exports to China growing faster than anywhere else. The other thing I would point to in this chart is the lower two boxes, which have circles on them, which are the share of Chinese indirect steel exports going to the U.S. and the EU, and have gone from 45%, almost 50%, down to 25% or 25-30% of total. Again, this is consistent with what we saw previously in that the share of machinery and equipment, the proportionate share of machinery and equipment of Chinese indirect steel exports has been increasing. So clearly there's been some of that substitution there, that the Chinese machinery exports are taking the share from US and EU. Okay, so now bring it down a level to Latin America. This is the same chart that we saw earlier for all of China steel exports, both direct and indirect. Direct exports are in blue, indirect exports are in red, and we see that even with the growth in indirect steel exports, particularly the last few years, that the direct exports, China direct steel exports, are still greater than indirect exports. And I'll say to date, right, because this is still very much, I would say, uncertain or in process, and this is kind of what we're going to try and focus on. Ignore the noise in the direct steel numbers in 2021. There's just some noise in the numbers. You could think of that as sort of continuing development. But significantly, direct and indirect steel exports kind of, I wouldn't say stable, but were relatively unchanged until, like everything else, until the pandemic, in which case, after which both direct and indirect steel exports really took off. Okay, these charts show the share of all Latin American indirect steel imports that are supplied by China. Okay, China's share of Latin America's indirect steel imports. The left side shows the progression for all of Latin America and shows that Chinese share of indirect imports into Latin America has grown from 16% to 49%, or 48%, hard to see from here. The right-hand chart is that same chart, but without Mexico. And there you see that Chinese share has grown of indirect steel imports has grown from 20% to 63, almost 65%. Obviously, the impact of removing Mexico from this particular chart is that Mexico, even as it is a prime destination for a lot of Chinese indirect exports, still has the closer ties from a supply chain standpoint with the U.S., right? So that is why that China represents a smaller percentage of Mexico's indirect steel imports than it does for the other Latin American countries. Okay, just looking a little bit at the sector mix. This is comparing 2010, 2023. What is the left bars within each pair are the overall mix of China's sector destinations. The right-hand side, the right in the pair is Latin America. China's indirect steel exports to Latin America. And you see that in both time periods, automotive, China's indirect steel exports to the Latin American automotive sector represent a higher percentage of their total exports than they do to the rest of the world. Again, we see that in 2023, just looking at that top line, that China's, and we saw this in the previous slide, indirect steel exports to the automotive sector were 19% for the world, for all of China, 25% or so for Latin America. One thing I should have mentioned before, when we talk about automotive shipments, I'm going to come on to this, there's actually, you've got to remember that's cars, trucks, buses, and very significantly automotive parts and components. And that's what we're going to turn to now. Not quite yet, I've got one slide before, which is the country mix of Chinese indirect steel exports. Again, we see that even with that strong presence of U.S. in the Mexican supply chain, Mexico is still the largest destination, or if you use the word recipient, of China's indirect steel exports. Mexico, all the regions have grown. Brazil is 20%. We saw Mexico at 32%, Chile 4%. And you'll see that the bottom brown bars are shipments to all the other countries. And you see that China's, use the word invasion, has sort of extended, broadly throughout Latin America. Okay, so, how do we measure the impact? And again, there have been earlier presentations which looked, obviously we're focused on manufacturing supply chain. An earlier presentation looked at manufacturing as a percentage of GDP. What I've done here, I'm focusing on the metric of MVA, manufacturing value added, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the value that a country adds to its raw materials in the processing of those raw materials. And here on an index basis, the blue line is basically Latin America MVA on a constant dollar basis. Basically, over this time period, there's been no improvement in manufacturing value added in value added in 2015 constant dollars. The red line is the numbers, just a different way of expressing China's indirect exports into Latin America, just another way of showing the numbers. The green line is for all. And again, someone's going to quick to remind you that coinciding or correlation is not the same thing as causality. I can't prove, but clearly that China is the cause of the stagnation in Latin American manufacturing activity, but clearly, and there have been other factors mentioned previously, it is a major contributing factor. And I'm looking at the time, I'm going to have to go more quickly. So let's just dig a little deeper. China's indirect steel exports to Mexico. On the left-hand side, it shows the percentage of those which are passenger vehicles as opposed to parts and components. So again, we know, and again, this is just through 2023, that the share that's finished passenger vehicles has increased to 27%, but the imports of parts has also continued to grow. The right-hand chart shows, again, I apologize, it's difficult to read, but it shows on a value basis, the type of indirect steel imports from China into the Mexican automotive industry. What's circled in brown are bodies and body parts, basically. The body in white, what have you, right? The flat roll intensive part. That has continued to grow significantly. The other bar to the right is engines, which of course, especially from an SBQ standpoint, are highly steel intensive. Okay, now trying to bring this back to China's outbound fixed asset investment strategy or activity, and to sort of show how it's all interconnected. Again, this is just through, this data is through 2024. Again, it's on a percentage basis. It shows at the top red, the increase in share of Chinese outbound foreign direct investment into Latin America, going into automotive. Interesting, the metals and mining, the lower blue, parenthetically, that the beginning, 2 decades ago was dominant. By kind of middle of last decade, fell down to 21% of total Chinese outbound fixed asset foreign direct investment into Latin America. Interesting increase recently, and we could attribute that to their growing interest, if I could use that word, with lithium with rare earths. Right, so again, we're seeing numbers actually pick up there, but that's not iron ore. For the most part, that's rare earths that they're going for. Okay, getting close to the end here. So this chart, is difficult to read, and I don't think you need to, try to read it. But the point is, in 2024, a study was done of the largest Chinese investments in the Mexican automotive parts industry. Right, so this goes to the question, are they localizing? Right, are they building up manufacturing assets or manufacturing capabilities in Mexico to be able to, yes, support their sales ambitions, but also, potentially increase demand for steel. What this study shows is the opposite. The 12 largest Chinese investments in the Mexican auto parts industry have been in aluminum castings and electronics. Okay, so they are investing, and this will come on to my concluding points. Looking at numbers of total investments or total FDI, even into the sector, could give a false impression or false confidence that the China is making an effort, to build up local supply chains. Well, perhaps they are, but it's in a way so far in Mexico they're not doing it in a way that's supporting steel consumption in Mexico. Which brings me to the concluding points, messages, implications. So obviously, as we've been hearing all along, the threat from Chinese indirect steel imports, exports into Latin America, the threat is huge, it's growing. Continuous monitoring is essential. I think what Acero is doing with OECD, what Anthony mentioned earlier, is Acero is sort of pioneering the effort or leading the effort to establish much closer monitoring of Chinese, all of activities, but including indirect steel exports. As I said before, devil's in the details. So when we monitor sector, you want to look at carefully to monitor the sector and product mix, right, of those indirect steel imports. Are they components, final products, or are they productive capital assets? If they're components, how do they fit into the local supply chain? Who owns the importing companies? Right? Are these more Chinese companies, or are they supplying into a domestic industry? And is the output that's comes from the processing of those indirect steel imports, is that staying in the domestic market, or is that being re-exported? All questions that we need to try and understand and monitor. And again, monitor Chinese fixed outbound FDI. FDI in general can be positive for an economy, not necessarily for the steel industry, because again, the devil's in the details. What are the criteria that the governments use in evaluating or prioritizing inbound FDI from China into their economies? Clearly, employment impacts are essential. Total value is the value of the investment is a key metric. They're all appropriate, but they need to be applied from a steel industry standpoint in conjunction with an explicit strategy to strengthen domestic steel manufacturing supply chains. Again, I'll go quickly. This is in contrast, or building upon the prior slide about Mexico parts investments in aluminum castings, electronics. We think about what China's, and this goes to the slide I showed earlier about increase in mining outbound FDI. China investing in a lithium mine, right, is FDI. China investing in the processing of that lithium is measured as FDI. China is using that even if they make a battery in that country are all examples that depending on the government's criteria would all be net positives. However, if you look at that chain, it doesn't do a lot for steel. So again, devil's in the details. And again, I just want to reinforce and applaud, what Acero and what OECD are doing. And again, I think that, the message is, Acero in the lead, but the efforts of Anthony, the OECD Steel Committee, in addressing this huge global problem are just essential. So with that, I will say thank you.
Gracias.